The Agora podcast is covered by a BIPCOT no-gov license. Use and reuse is free and encouraged by anyone except governments or their agents. Find out more at bipcot.org.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop.
You were born free, you got fucked out of half of it, and you wave a flag celebrating.
Central authority has just embedded right in it its own problem, and that is that it means a few people make decisions for many people.
Unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Agora podcast. As usual, this is your home for agorism, localism, radical decentralization, and anti-authoritarian concepts. Coming at you with another episode with Agora here, and another guest that we've brought to the table. Given that introduction, I think that our today's guest is kind of fits right along lines with some of those principles that we kind of mentioned in the tagline there, specifically localism and decentralization. But I mean, we touch on all four of those, of course, in the conversation. We have Adrian Shepard from the Springtime of Nations YouTube channel, and also active on Twitter if you're familiar with him there. Adrian, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and the key topics that you like to focus on?
Sure. Our channel, I mean, I'm just one of a couple people that work on Springtime of Nations. We focus on the concept of pan-secessionism as a global strategy for libertarians. And what we mean when we say pan-secessionism, and most people understand it as, at least in libertarian circles, is the idea that the more states, the better. The breaking up of large states, especially, and a focus on smaller states creates more freedom, just because of a freedom to vote with your feet, to move to other places they would like more. Secession is, has historical roots in classical liberalism, with the Springtime of Nations that are channel references. The Springtime of Nations 1848, where liberal nationalists at least tried to take down most of the great states of Europe. And what Springtime of Nations would like is if there was a global movement to do like a second Springtime of Nations, to break down the huge empires, the huge countries of the world, create more polities, and therefore increase freedom.
Okay, that is both, it really interests me, and I can see like a lot of arguments for and against. I think this is going to be a great discussion on that, because I think we're all familiar with, regardless of where you're from. I know a lot of our audience is US based and a lot isn't. The idea of secession, both historically and as an idea of potentiality. So how do you approach this topic as far as tying it in specifically with libertarianism? Because, you know, historically we can certainly see that secession movements haven't been like necessarily strongly tied to libertarian or liberal ideas.
That's right. Secession movements, as we've covered, we have about almost 30 now different videos on specific separatist movements, historical and current, and they run the gamut of ideology from like good to bad. Generally speaking, we won't cover like we wouldn't cover the Shining Path or something as like a positive example, but generally speaking, like there are Marxist-Leninist groups that we've covered. There's some libertarian ones like the Zapatistas and Magnovia that we've covered, but really like liberal, conservative, leftist. Secession does not have a flag in that sense. There's separate general like, you know, just as a matter of, you know, like a, you know, the law of large numbers, lots of separatist movements, not a lot of them libertarian. So why should libertarians support secessionist movements? The reason isn't necessarily that there will be libertarian separatist movements if we just embrace them. Like, we're not going to convert Sinn Féin to market liberalism. But if we support these kinds of movements, not only does this mean we could change domestic opinion wherever we live. I mean, I think we're all Americans here. So if for some reason, somehow we were able to convince the general public to be more accepting of separatist movements in other countries, maybe a libertarian secessionist movement would be more successful. That's one argument why we should support pan-secession. Another reason is an example I often use in Somalia. Northern Somalia has a unrecognized state, Somaliland, which is actually far more liberal, far more stable than the greater Somalia. And it has been like independent of the state since 1992. And it has recognized the libertarian microstate of Liberland as a reciprocal agreement. Liberland recognizes Somaliland, vice versa. So there's a chance where we can make strategic pacts on a diplomatic international level that can further the cause of libertarian secession and libertarianism in general.
So what you're saying is that we should move to Somalia? Is that what you're saying?
Well,
no, I'm kidding.
I'm actually,
I'm kidding.
Well, here's the thing. I would not be opposed to an African Free State project where, I mean, especially African libertarians, but maybe more generally anyone, like, come to Somaliland because it's a burgeoning, like, free port, basically. While it's not internationally recognized by states, it's a shipping center. Its capital is a large port. It's right on the Red Sea. I would, like, if someone tells me to go to Somalia, like, you know, I mean, this is like a nerdy like response, but like, oh well, maybe Somaliland someday. Like, it's a stable liberal society there. I mean, it's not perfect, but it has, like, you know, the meme about Somalia is obviously that it's violent, it's unstable, there's no government, right? So libertarians should go there. Somaliland has had a democratically elected government like for 30 years. Like, it's an abnormal country in Africa because it has had peaceful transfers of power like consistently. So, I mean, maybe move to Somaliland.
Yeah, well, I'm surprised that this is actually something that has kind of flown under the radar for most libertarians, because what you're describing, I've vaguely heard of it, the concepts here and there, but like I really had no idea. So that's an interesting story.
I got two. Actually, Mike, Mike, Penguin, your mic is coming in a little hot.
Good call.
I got two questions. One, are you an anarchist?
I'm an anarcho-capitalist. Yes.
Okay. And two, you see this as a valuable strategy for what specifically?
Well, I as an anarchist, what a market anarchist, I think the strategy should be to increase liberty, like as a net. Like we should be working to make more freedom. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and you know what? I really like that you pointed out and called yourself an anarcho-capitalist, because I've become. So I know we get back into like semantics land again, but I think that the term is very, very useful for discussing something other than complete anarchy and lack of like governing institutions. That there's a different approach, but perhaps a very pragmatic and it's certainly a different approach, so that there can't be this constant critique of you support any sort of governing institution or large structure on the road to liberation, decentralization, localism, all of the concepts that we kind of enshrine here on the podcast. And I think that the very best ANCAPs that I've heard, the ones that have really done their reading and really thought through their ideas, like have really put forth some innovative things, whether it's like the C stutters or like ideas like your guys in your channel.
Well, thank you. I think there's a lot of wrong with like anarcho-capitalist, not theory. I think anarcho-capitalist theory is quite healthy. Anarcho-capitalist rhetoric, I think, in the last 5 years or so has been kind of lacking, especially when it comes to seeing. I mean, well, there's all kinds of, like, we'll be here all day if there's critiques about ANCAPs and like how they conduct themselves. But I would say the reason I really jumped on the opportunity to be on this podcast is because I think left market anarchism is just such a natural ally to what you might call right libertarianism. And it's, I mean, honestly, like, as much hate as he gets, from like left wing, like LWMAs, and like centrist ANCAPs, whatever. But like Tom Woods' friendship with Gary Chartier, or Rod Long's friendship with Stephan Kinsella. These are very valuable things. I mean, that they consider each other like, one, good people, and two, like, useful intellectuals.
Yeah,
So
the series that Tom Woods did with Gary Chartier, that warmed my heart. I was glad to see it, and it was a great conversation to be had. He did a whole week-long series with him not that long ago. And no, I agree that in certain circumstances, bridges between different sort of sub-ideologies make a lot of sense and are also very valuable, obviously, for long-term strategy, especially if the people in question are motivated to actually do something to further these ideas in practice. As it doesn't necessarily matter what your pet set of economics or whatever it is. It's what are you doing and how are you treating people, right? So that a lot of sort of friendships and bridges can be made by putting aside certain things for the sake of actually getting shit done. I think, but let me now let me put a counter argument to what you're saying. And I wouldn't advocate doing this, but it's actually the case. I think the case that a large central bloated bureaucracy would actually mean more individual freedom for most people. Now, here's why. A small localized government will actually run efficiently and properly. So that means that most of the infringements on your individual liberty will be executed locally, efficiently, and properly. So that means you're less likely to get away with things. Whereas a large, bloated central bureaucracy, they don't have an effective means of enforcement, which is why you see such a blossoming gray market in so many things, because the federal government is not capable of enforcing most things. And they tend to just focus on the worst crimes that people are committing, or the easiest and the in certain cases, especially with localities. So it might actually be more beneficial in terms of individual freedom if we have just this large, bloated, centralized government that is incapable of actually doing anything, so that we can exercise our own individual freedom and autonomy locally and develop our own institutions and for dispute resolution or security or any of those things. I think that most tyranny comes from that actually affects our daily lives doesn't come from a federal government or any of the sort. For the most part, it's your local government. And this is, to me, why I don't see it doesn't seem to compute when the more I think about secession personally, but because it's not Joe Biden that's screwing with my life. It's the local code enforcement. It's your property taxes. It's whatever regulation about having a garden or collecting water. It's sales tax. And it's permits for setting up a farmer's market. None of these things come from the federal government. They all come from your local government. So your local government is actually the greatest arbiter of tyranny in your personal life. And I don't see how having more focus on local tyranny is necessarily going to lead to individual freedom.
Okay, well, what I would say to that is, while that's true, I mean, we all are aware of the base petty tyranny of local governments everywhere. Everyone knows how stupid those laws can be and how it really just will ruin your day, ruin your business, right? The federal government, again, I mean, it's not protecting you from any of that. But two, and more importantly, the things that really make local and state government awful, and in America specifically, just evil, do ultimately come from the U.S. federal government. For example, militarization of police. That's a DoD program, selling, MRAP, selling riot gear, selling automatic weapons. Without a strong federal government, I mean, listen, cops have basically always been bad since they were invented in the 19th century. But this new militarization trend is subsidized by the federal government. And of course, you have the drug war, another huge like aspect of people's lives where, people's lives are ruined. They're thrown in jail. They're shot, killed. Ultimately, that came from the federal government. So I think we should not ignore that localism does not mean libertarianism. But on the other hand, the worst excesses of like local government, state government are always aided and abetted by Washington.
I mean, I think that's a good point. I think that you have two notions here, and one is that the localized institutions and local governments and everything are quite possibly going to be more responsive to the needs of a lot of people, more responsive to like the preferences and the input of a certain range of people in the community. And the more local you get, the more so that's the case. But then also, there's certainly class distinctions and just the fact that there are busybodies and tyrants basically that do exist, I think, kind of scattered about everywhere, and people with different class interests. And I think Sec has a good point. The counter argument is the local government has more ability to see through the people in its jurisdiction, like transparently, for the same reasons, and to kind of act more effectively on them. And so you have that effect working in both directions. Both directions. But I certainly like the idea of the breakup of large empires, and you really can kind of count the large powers and large nation states as effectively, an empires, as in, centrally governed, militaristic states that control many nations. And if you just kind of change that to like many communities. So, for example, the United States, each individual state is called a state, and it's a rather large territory that could be independently functioning. And that added layer of government that's also militaristically expansionist and has a worldwide, a global military footprint, most definitely qualifies as a form of kind of like liberal empire. Well, pretty illiberal, but an empire nonetheless. And I think, not even thinking about American secessionism in general, but just trying to put this into a global perspective, I think that that to see people want to kind of break up the idea of big is good could be a net benefit, regardless of, because you're certainly not going to have it turn out this way, regardless of the exact nature of like the movements or even the motives of individuals.
I'm so glad you actually said the liberal empire thing, because I think that is sort of, Jefferson referred to a liberal empire as his idea for a continental United States. But unfortunately, the liberal empire never materialized. It was co-opted immediately by authoritarianism, by imperialism. I mean, you can think like America before it spanned from sea to sea versus after, like it was less authoritarian. And like you also mentioned, I mean, there's the global context too, because the United States government, federal government, is not just oppressing its internal citizens, right? And maybe in a certain sense, like, yes, like Sec said, it's a lot more, usually it's a lot more esoteric, the kinds of oppressions we're being, subjected to from the federal government versus from the state government or local, where that's true. But for a citizen of Yemen, for a citizen of Niger, for a citizen of, a dozen countries. The U.S. government's influence on their lives is nothing short of catastrophic. So destroying the empire by breaking it up would do massive amounts of good. And this is also true for lots of, like the breakup of the Russian Empire, the breakup of the Chinese Empire. It would free people from terrorism and like mass murder. And I think that's a very important point to consider.
Yeah, I'm so glad you just added that last part there, because that's the importance of necessarily making it a like pan-secessionist movement. This only works as if it's a global pan-secessionist movement that wants to break up every single one of these empires just as badly and simultaneously, and full support for each other. Otherwise, the argument's always going to be, one empire is just going to kind of come in and take the place of another once the central controlling structures are weakened enough to allow for secession or strong federalism or whatever. So yeah, that's
right.
super
Exactly.
important.
The springtime of nations wasn't engineered by any one power. It was all of them. All of them were seeing threats at the same time. So that's what should happen again.
Yeah. So I mean, that characteristic of this is key, and it has to be. And I think one counter argument that comes from that, though, as important as that is that so a lot of these movements for secession or something along the lines can be kind of closed, kind of inward thinking, maybe parochial, movements based around, ethnicity or language or possibly religion. And also religious movements can be very large depending on the religion and the nature of the movement. But they can often be very kind of closed mind, wanted to like wall in a certain communitarian group, I suppose. I guess generally the word is being very parochial, but a global pan-secessionist movement, on the other hand, so not very liberal in that sense, but a global pan-secessionist movement would require, fellowship with people all over the world of many different cultures, and like, that kind of fellowship, between Liberland and Somaliland and whatnot that you gave an example. But imagine that as like a distributed thing where it's happening all throughout all these different secessionist movements scattered about the globe. And I think that almost would require a sort of cosmopolitanism, a sort of balance that would be hard to imagine. Like all the people, a lot of people could probably do this. I think I understand how you could come to this kind of mindset, but I think it would also be a mindset that wouldn't be come easily to every type of secessionist movement, if that makes any sense.
Of course. I mean, like I said, secessionist movements run the gamut. We've covered the Boers. We've even covered the southern nationalists, both from the 1860s to like today, the Southern American nationalists. There are illiberal forces all over the world that want to secede. What I think is the best test case for this is Burma, where, well, I have a lot to say, actually. I mean, I'll say the Burma thing. It's all like, I think you have extremely good counter arguments, and I want to try to do them all at the same time in my brain. But okay, so let's focus on Burma. The Burmese civil war has been waged by the central government with the ethnic majority against a huge range of different ethnic groups. You got the Kachin, you got the Kogang, you got the Arakkans. They're all fighting the central state. And in the 2000s or whatever, they actually allied with each other against the central government, like in a formal alliance. They call it the Northern Alliance because most of the ethnic minorities are in the north. But their end goal is secession for their constituent nations. It's not they want to be a confederation. I put it like this in the video I made on the Burmese separatists. They're freeing themselves from each other. The agreement is we defeat the central government and we go our separate ways. In my mind, a pan-secessionist global movement that has that kind of mentality of we need to fight these people and then we can live our own lives separate from each other. We don't need, like, cosmopolitanism, I'm not against it or whatever, but we should recognize that, like, a lot of people, especially in the global south, are not cosmopolitan culturally. But what they can grasp, what they do, a libertarian idea that they do understand is the idea of just like, I have my thing, you have your thing. Right? You also see this in the Ethiopian civil war of the past couple of years. It's the Omoro and the Tigres not saying we want to be, instead of Ethiopia, it's Tigray or Moro. It's saying we're fighting, side by side, but we don't want to be like, we don't need to be together, right? And when it comes to like your point about religion specific, but also, I mean, any of these things, linguistic minorities, whatever. But the point is, I think it is a libertarian instinct, a libertarian movement to be like, my minority is being oppressed by a central government. I need to protect it. And if liberal nationalism is the way to protect it, is, making it a known polity of, like, if, for example, we cover the Corsicans, having an independent Corsica, which, the parties are Corsican nationalists, and yes, they're exclusivist, basically, right? I don't think they're like racial essentialists. Most of them are on the left, but you could imagine that most of them at least want someone who wants to have like Corsican citizenship, to speak Corsican, adopt Corsican culture, etc. And that is exclusivist. But on the other hand, when you have a centralized government in Paris imposing rule on an island, and an island is saying, no, we don't want people from your island, from France, come here. We're our own people. I think that is like, that's a natural, like, as Bakunin, I'm sure you're aware, was kind of like a nationalist in that sense, that like there's an instinctual love of, your neighbor, your peers, your kin. And while that's not the be all end all of liberalism, right? Like, liberalism ultimately is universalist. It is cosmopolitanism. But if that kind of particularism is in opposition to imperialism, like the idea that like everyone belongs to us, this master race, right? The French, the German, the Italian just gets to dictate how other like people can live, then the more libertarian party has to be the minority. I don't know how you guys see it, but that's how I see it.
No, I think you make some good points. And let me just clarify my argument from before. I am not advocating a a large centralized organization. I don't believe large institutions work. I believe smaller decentralized local institutions work. That being said, a government is always going to be a purveyor of violence. So I don't want a purveyor of violence to work well. You know what I mean? So instead of local government, I would prefer self-governance, polycentrism, that sort of thing that's not necessarily tied to a geographic area. And I think you would agree with that as at least as an end goal. But my question is, I see this as a useful strategy for some reasons that you mentioned before, in the sense that the U.S. federal government is, killing thousands of babies in Yemen, and I think it could be a useful strategy for fracturing and balkanizing the powers of the world. It could be a useful sort of chink in the armor, or a wedge in the strength of nation states, to the point where it does not allow them to purvey violence as effectively throughout the world. That being said, I don't necessarily think that this correlates to individual freedom necessarily. I mean, yes, you've agreed to this and we've kind of gone over this, but I just don't see how you get from small local government to freedom, or to an anarchist society. Like, I don't see those. I can't see how those steps would work in reality. I think, like I said, it could be very useful to counteract the prevailing empires of the world. Maybe we can cause them a lot of havoc. I think that, I think that the Irish nationalism for a long time is part of the reason that the British Empire fell apart, because they were just spending so much time dicking around with the IRA and internal domestic problems, that it just became hard. That, and World War I and a lot of other combining factors that helped to destroy the British Empire, I think. So I think I agree that this could be a very useful strategy for certain things. I just don't see the connection between this and then how this ends up being individual freedom and autonomy and anarchism.
Okay. I think, well, I'll go through the kind of this is common. You've probably actually heard this before, right? This specific thing, that microstates, generally speaking, are more libertarian than large countries like Andorra, Malta, San Marino, Liechtenstein, of course, being probably the only libertarian, quote unquote, like Nozikian libertarian country that exists. Singapore, all of these like little microstates, these small countries, are very free economically and socially. Maybe not so much socially in Singapore, but it's a very wealthy, very well managed country. And I think your critique of, like, yes, smaller countries can also be very authoritarian in some senses is true, but I feel like to a certain extent technology has closed the gap for, like, and this is certainly true of America, and like settler countries like Argentina, for example. There was large tracts of land that were basically there was a Wild West in Argentina, just like America, but eventually all that stuff gets connected, and suddenly the federal government like does exist, or state governments as well. Both countries are federal states. So I'm a little skeptical of the idea of just having a tied up bureaucracy that can't do anything right. I mean, they do like they kill hundreds and thousands of people every year. They collect trillions of tax revenue. I mean, Yes, the bureaucracy. Well, it's almost, the concept of anarcho-tyranny, right? Like, they're good at bad stuff and they're bad at good stuff. So you have an anarcho-tyrannous state that, it takes a long time to like get something approved, whatever, but they can like instantly like no knock SWAT raid like a house that they think has like marijuana smoke or whatever, right? Like they're good. They're, as Hoppe would say, it's a competition in producing bads.
Yeah, I don't think that for example, the no knock raids and drug war and stuff. Yes, they are like pervaded by not only by the local authorities. I don't think that like a fractured. I definitely like to use the word balkanized, but like a fractured, world where these localities are part of more, let's say, part of a series of microstates. Like I don't see that happening without the strong federal government, even if like the connections here or like the causation here is opaque. I don't think that happens in a world without a very strong federal government, without a directly subsidizing this, but also like the class of people that are ultimately like not pulling the strings, but like the constituents of the government that are really somewhat pulling the strings and funding campaigns and behind the politicians on a national level. That quote unquote elite class of people can't have that sway as nearly as much with a kind of balkanized kind of microstate reality.
There's a I don't know if you guys are familiar with the term Kabinettskrieg, but this basically, okay, between the 30 Years' War and the Napoleonic Wars, the wars that actually happened did not create mass casualties, especially not mass civilian casualties. And the reason for this that historians come up with is because the idea was the king financed his own wars. And when the money runs out, you can't hire mercenaries. You don't want to draft people because people will get angry, there'll be uprisings, etc. Way easier to hire mercenaries. So you have wars between different teams of mercenaries, basically. I mean, 7 Years' War is a good example of this. There's a ton of different Anglo-Franco wars, which fit very neatly in this Queen Anne's War, etc. But basically, the king finances his own war from his own treasury, and mercenaries fight in a field until someone wins or whatever. Like capitals aren't bombarded, like places aren't looted or whatever. But after the French Revolution, in France, there's general mobilization. It's no longer mercenaries are going to be paid by the king. It's the nation calling you up for service to defend the republic. And millions of men were raised. Like, this is why France was so deadly, especially in the early years, is because it had a huge army that it raised from conscripts. And this is why the Napoleonic Wars were so bloody. Other countries had to reciprocate. Britain, Austria, Germany, etc. Russia, of course. And, millions of young men died. I'm using this historical example to sort of point to the idea of like a localism, which it's like, okay, yes, there's wars, they're bad, people die or whatever, but when you give it an imperial context, when it's a national greatness thing, millions of people can die in these things. I mean, the French Empire versus the British Empire, way more deadly than like the Kingdom of France and the Kingdom of Britain, like kind of just funding their own little wars or whatever. It's the analogy is basically the wealth that the federal government can provide, can subsidize through like grand taxation, is way more dangerous than what the state of Illinois can subsidize to do.
Okay, I don't know if this relates to the Hoppe's argument that you kind of alluded to earlier, but I think what we're saying here is that many of the bads that large governments do are things that actually are effectively, and this kind of really ties back to like what we talked about on our podcast, are things that are effectively done at scale and are very hard to do at a very small scale. Whereas some types of governance that can be like, genuine public goods are done at some of the smallest scales. So is that kind of along the lines of what you're saying? So in the sense of like, large prison system, large war mobilization, or global military, global military deployments, etc.
I mean, we've already talked about the foreign policy, military aspect. But I mean, even like anything that's like a great imposition of, like, okay, so local governments, I think, are petty tyrants, but no local government like did something as horribly catastrophic. It's like, let's just say like the Great Wall of China, right? Like thousands of workers died building that. And of course, there's more recent, like the Holodomor or whatever. Like the kinds of policies local governments can pursue do not have, I mean, just because of the scale, right? This is why I think Marxist, Leninist, separatist organizations are not like just like immediately excommunicable from the springtime of nations idea. Okay, if Tigray wants to collectivize agriculture, they can still import food, right? If like it inevitably fails. But an entire empire, the Ethiopian Empire collectivizing, which it did, and causing a famine, which it did, that's a lot harder to fix. I mean, this is kind of the whole thing of like a laboratory of democracy, right? I mean, that's what people say, like when they want to advocate for federalism, is like, oh, we'll try different ideas or whatever. Like, yeah, like if Louisiana became a communist country, there wouldn't be a massive famine because they could just buy food from neighboring countries, right? But these huge, like if the United States became a communist country, like we don't have the money to just buy. Like, I mean, we produce half the food in the world. There's a huge famine because of collectivization policies. Like millions of people would just starve to death, right? I think keeping in mind the question of scale is important when we're talking about pan-secession.
Yeah, no, I actually I totally agree with most of what you just said, and to me this is like the argument for anarchism, right? In the sense that it's the argument that well, wouldn't there be warlords and blah 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 in an anarchist society? And essentially, you're right that a nation state can more effectively and at scale execute violence on other people and its own its own military more effectively than, or with more ability and more resources than, say, a small collective or band of people. This is the argument for decentralization, and I agree. In an anarchist setting, we just would not have the ability to operate military at scale like that in an offensive manner. And the same thing with most other things. I think local systems of whatever it is, economics, production, governance. These are all fine things, and they tend to be more responsive and effective to the individual needs involved. Provided they're somewhat bottom up and participatory. So I don't think we disagree. I mean, we're all localists to some extent here. I'm just not, I'm not ready to jump on put too much stock in like, getting, Texas to secede or whatever the thing is. Do you find that this would be a better strategy or more effective than just building the institutions we want to see, rather than this sort of essentially a trip through political action to try to devolve systems through the system, rather than just building an entirely new system?
I mean, yes, the difference is when we're talking about a pan-secessionist strategy is not just to say it's good that whatever Ted Cruz is going to become president of Texas or whatever. It's to leverage our support for that for Texas support of New Hampshire or wherever. I mean, anywhere. Texas support for the South Brazil movement that wants to break off from Brazil. Or, I mean, when you're talking about why do we care about localism or smaller territorially or population wise government, that Grover Norquist quote of like, I want a government small enough to drown in a bathtub, right? Once you get a government small enough to drown in a bathtub, at least population wise, just drown it. Once we have small microstates, like libertarian uprisings can be extremely effective. I mean, you can think of all the microstates in the Pacific. Like, they have tiny militaries, tiny governments. A dedicated set of people could very easily take those over. Not advocating that anyone necessarily does that, but I mean, it's not that hard to, for example, topple the government of Kiribati. We could probably 1,000 people. And if those 1,000 people believe in the right, the NAP, if they're libertarians, I mean, Kiribati would just become libertarian. They would just abolish all laws or whatever. It's a very immediate benefit. And this goes for basically all microstates. And if the world was microstates, then our strategy would be so much easier, because all we have to do is get enough people to topple a government with or a region with 500,000 people or 2,500 people.
Yeah, we're talking about scalability a lot, so I generally am highly skeptical of government, and certainly the state. But scalability does apply to governing systems, and government itself isn't necessarily state government, although we usually referring to the government of states. But I think we should say that while democracy certainly has its flaws, it's also a very broad term. I think that democracy at a small scale, like a lot of things, works a lot better, just not just in a linear way, is a lot better functioning at smaller and at the smallest of scales than like a representative democracy or direct democracy or whatever. Direct democracy probably at the smallest of scales. It does work better than trying to scale it up to at the level that's attempted with, say, the United States, even with all the little tricks and kind of institutions that kind of try to make it stable. I think that you do have some benefit other than just saying this is just a way to ultimately get to toppling all states for individual freedom, because that is not the not the necessary end goal that this would have. But yeah, I think given what's the topics that are in the news right now, some hot button issues, I think the idea of like strong federalism or states' rights, or like the equivalent just generally and not just in the United States context. You mentioned laboratories of democracy. For example, that's very pertinent right now. I think I've had a lot of thoughts about that. And so the first thing I think of is the states' rights. Just the term states' rights and what it entails. It's not libertarian. It's not libertarian at all. However, like if you take, for example, the current day U.S., and you did have a strong federalism and a very minimal footprint of the federal government, I think it's not so much that, we'd have laboratories of democracy, because that concept can be flawed by, the fact that states, contain lots of different diverse classes of people and groups of people and communities, and they necessarily do because they're centered around, urban centers and rural areas and different kinds of communities and industries. Okay, but another competing issue, kind of a pro of this, is market competition. So market competition between microstates or strong federal states, which would have a tremendous, like a strong U.S. states would have a tremendous power over its citizens, with largely uncheckable in this example. But they would also be, so that by being under this United States umbrella, they would then be in competition with each other, which one would think would promote a couple of things. So you'd have the argument for the states being more responsive to like the preferences and the regional characteristics and the preferences of the communities in them, and which are obviously people differ on lots of different things. But they'd also be in competition for more libertarian and liberal policies, and maybe just a smaller footprint and a smaller ability to kind of instill a tyranny without that protection of the federal government, and without that kind of managing of things that kind of, counteract some of the negative effects of like government regulation and tariffs and trade barriers and various things. So I think that competition between microstates, just to sum all that up, could be the best argument for like these devolved microstates.
I mean, I'm not really, well, I think these are good points. My only reservation is, I think it is more than that. I think, how do I, I'm trying to think of how to word this. Basically, okay, so I think all right. I think the badness of a state, to disagree, I think with Sex, like, really first point is the badness of a state really does increase with distance. I really do think that, like, the ability to see people as your own kin is an important, like, part of, like, kind of like the internal check on rulers. I think that's not, and I think to a certain extent that's why I and Springtime of Nations in general see liberal nationalism as a check against state power, not just because like liberalism is a check against state power, but because a polity that's like where the majority is someone that's speaks the same language. There's no, and this can be like divided down, of course, because we're anarchists, like down to the individual, as you said. But like starting from the groundwork of like people who do have the same culture should govern themselves. That principle, and this is basically like Misesian minarchism, right? Is that you just divide down based on who you have like something in common with someone, right? Like Mises basically said, like a town could like be a nationalist, town nationalism. He wasn't ready to go all the way to the individual, but like that kind of shows like that's the path, right? You go from empire to country to nation to micronation to neighborhood, and then you finally reach what we all want, which is that someone can determine their own destiny for themselves.
Okay, let me bounce this off of you real quick then. Like, I think I kind of disagree with that notion, just because it's not taking into consideration other arguments. Like, let's say almost Marxist kind of. I'm very conscious of the concept of class, and it does play a lot of role here. And that kind of overshadows the idea that people with a common language or common, supposed common culture is somewhat geographically tied, or maybe a little bit more loosely so, do naturally form some kind of nation, because there's also competing class interests involved. So that the idea is that, that's not the only thing that people can hold in common or as differences. So that's a big negative. But I think the initial argument you made could be also put in liberal individualist terms, which I think does support your argument. And this is how I felt it. Not that necessarily people see each other as kin, which I think is very almost traditionalist sounding, but that I guess at the smaller scale, people could kind of see each other in the liberal sense as means of themselves and not, or ends of themselves and not means to an end. And I think that's the backbone of why I think individualism is supremely important, is because I think to see other people as ends and, agent, moral and economic agents, and people with, souls or whatever, however you want to put it. I think that's the idea is central. The idea that we do see others that kind of under the same institutional umbrellas as being like ends and of themselves and actual as human beings, and not as statistics or just people to use as means to an end.
Well, it could go either way, right? So like, there is some truth to what you say, that it's people have the potential, if they have to deal with you on a day-to-day basis and you're familiar and your neighbors and your kids play soccer together or whatever the thing is, that they might be less oppressive to you, and they might see you more as a human rather than some statistic in Washington. But on the other sense, this is discounting sort of busybodies and Karens and lawn Nazis, right? So like somebody in the EPA might just see me as a number, right? Or might just not have the time or to worry about some little thing, right? They've got so much on their plate just by sheer volume. They cannot effectively enforce it on everyone, and they're, most likely going to go off after the biggest and easiest, right? So you can see it either way. It really kind of just depends. Like, depends on who your neighbors are, right? So like, somebody local to me is driving by my house every day and sees that I got fucking chickens in my backyard, and we're not supposed to have chickens in your backyard, and wants to nitpick about this or that. Then they're on the council, or they know somebody on the council, so therefore they're going to be a pain in my ass, right? Whereas somebody from the EPA, they're seeing like 100,000 whatever complaints or whatever a day. They just cannot effectively enforce all of them, so your chances of slipping through the cracks are much greater. So it's kind of one of those things where when things are good, they're good on a local level. But when they go bad, they go real fucking bad because now you're with these people every day. They're hassling you about whatever. Oh, I'm very sorry. Your grass is 4 inches instead of the 3 inches and a quarter. You're gonna have to cut that. And it's just like the nightmare of like an HOA or the local Karen who wants to talk to the manager of the town council. So it's a coin toss essentially, because you can greatly benefit from the lack of the ability, just because of sheer volume, for a federal agency to effectively enforce their own codes or laws. But a local government, all of those people that are in that local government live right down the road from you, and they drive by your house and they know for fucking sure that your grass is 3.5 inches instead of 3.25, and they're going to fine you every day until it's cut and blah 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 and ruin your day. And I'm very sorry that you can't have those tomatoes in your front lawn, and etc. Right? Whereas the lady working at the EPA, who just went through 7,000 complaints today, does not care that you have tomatoes in your front yard at all. You're just a number to her. So, like, which do you prefer? I prefer neither. I'm not advocating for a large federal government here. I'm just trying to make like a somewhat of a counter argument or a counterpoint here to show that it's not necessarily the case that yes, because you have a local government and these are people that you will deal with and are familiar with, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's fucking good, right? Because that also means you have to see these people every day and they see your property every day, and it's just more of a chance for them to ruin your day, as opposed to you being one number in a grand list on a computer database somewhere that nobody cares about. And they're government employees. They don't give a shit. They're just putting in their 8 hours and going home and doing the bare minimum anyway. So you can probably get away with a lot more. Just my thought.
Are you familiar with the term salutary neglect?
It rings a very vague bell, but what is that?
Okay, so it's okay. We'll just skip past that. Salutary neglect is what is referred to as the British Empire's policy towards the British colonies in North America, basically up until like after the 7 Years' War. Basically, the Empire thought it was too costly to actually enforce any of the laws they passed, on the United States. So, to a great deal, the United States had local control of basically everything for 100 years or so when they were forming their colonies. And then but once you've heard of about the Stamp Act, you get the Quebec Act, etc. This salutary neglect went away, and I bring it up because, great large states can basically preside over, they can be a lot more libertarian than local, because of course the colony of Virginia was enforcing laws way more and way worse than the kingdom of the United Kingdom of Scotland and England and Northern Ireland, or Ireland at the time. But ultimately, when the shoe hits, what is it, the shoe hits the floor or whatever, United Kingdom isn't fucking around. The potential of the federal government to just ruin your life is on a level like uncomparable with your HOA. Your HOA is gonna pester you and it's like, oh, you got a $50 fine for having, like, that sucks. That sucks, and it's bad. Like, people should not, do, like, they should not conduct themselves in a way that like their HOA has like a grass height limit. Okay, but like that woman that's like in the EPA that's like looking over, like just like lazily looking over your file, she could ruin your life. Just like your life's like done. Like you get a $50,000 fine for having what's that big thing? It's like, oh yeah, like unnavigable water over 50,000 square feet or something like that. It's like it's over. Like I mean, and you can't appeal.
Yeah, and that's if they don't kill you, right? I totally agree. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, but I mean, and that's how like the federal government rolls. It's like it's very slow to act, and then it just like kills you. Like local government, bad. State government also bad, and they can also kill you. Like that's clear, right? Like they kill you all the time. But when you get got by the feds, when you get got by the IRS, the EPA, whatever, the ATF, like there's no recourse. Like when you're got by the state, you have a recourse even to the federal government, which is happy to like destroy, state power. And, if you can benefit from that, all power to you, because states obviously like are also bad. But like, if it's the federal government going after you, you can't do anything. It's like, that's it. And that's the whole point of like, I mean, Murray Rothbard talks about this, like the nightmare of like world government is that there's nowhere to go. You can't flee if you don't like what the world government says. And on a like slightly smaller level, that's the point of pan-secessionism, is you can at least leave. You can at least leave with your life if you don't like what they're doing.
So here's where we probably overlap quite a bit, and actually I think we agree more than we disagree. It's just a matter of perspective on certain things. It's like with the local government, okay, so with the federal government, yeah, they will really ruin your life, but you have more of a chance of avoiding it, whereas the local government is probably less effective at ruining your life, but your chances are far greater just because you're closer, right? And there's less people for them to look at. But that wasn't my point. Where I think we overlap quite a bit is, are you familiar with municipalism?
Somewhat, yeah.
Okay. Have you ever read Neighborhood Power, The New Localism and or Community Technology by Carl Hess?
Regrettably, I've not.
Okay, well, we have an audiobook in our feed that we did of both of those books. And essentially his idea, and I think it would be right up your alley, is he was drawing on a lot of sort of municipalist thinkers, in the sense that he thought that, similar to what you think, that devolving power down to the local level, both in terms of governance and production, to the, I mean, minute local level, in the sense of like neighborhoods and blocks and streets, would be an effective strategy for providing the material base and the facts on the ground for achieving a free society. But it was more in the sense that we are literally just going to build this, right? So neighborhoods would put together organizations for, governance and collective action, decision making, that sort of thing. You would start to begin like local education and production systems, and cooperative machine shops and all these kinds of things. so you would have a stable, almost a stable neighborhood industry. Also local media about various things for that specific neighborhood. Food production it would be more localized, and you would have whatever you wanted to do, a neighborhood assembly for solving disputes and sort of collective decision making. But I think that this is almost the same thing as what you're saying, except for we don't necessarily need the municipalities or the states or the localities that exist currently. We can literally just build our own. Penguin, you're getting a lot of hiss. We can literally just build our own in our own neighborhoods, in our own communities. It's not necessary that we use, Catalonia or Texas or whatever, or the state of Jefferson and Northern California. We don't need these governmental jurisdictions that already exist. We can build our own affinity groups, essentially, in our local communities or for like-minded individuals. And that would even be a further devolution of power than what you're suggesting, I think. Also, we would build it from the ground up, so it would already necessarily be what the people that are involved and that directly affect it wanted it to be, right? So we don't even need these state jurisdictions. We'll just do what you're saying. We'll just build our own, though. Does that make sense? What do you think of that?
If it can be done, I definitely agree. Like, if someone can create anarchism in real life, it should always be supported over any kind of middle of the road, working towards, if you can do it, get it. And it should have all the support of every anarchist in the world, financially, morally, etc. What I'm saying is, I think the best road to a global anarchy, to destroying the empires that exist now, is this certain thing, and I think that will remove a huge threat to the development of anarchism and the development of people being able to do what they want without being terrorized by states. So okay. I agree. I totally agree with you. On a moral sense, it always has to be the secession of the individual. But all I'm saying is my strategy is that's just how I just see it. The way I see it is that let's get some microstates, and then we can kill the microstate rather than taking on the whole empire. Yeah, and so my idea of involving concepts of liberal nationalism, or nations or kinship groups in general, I think it's acceptable if we. I think it's not anathema to my thinking. I'm not really so much of a left market anarchist. I don't even really consider myself an anarchist in the traditional sense. But I do. I think we should look at this in the blends of both postmodernism and also pre-modernism. That obviously, nations, the concept of nations, big and small, is obviously social construct from the postmodernist sense, and they're also basically a social construct in the pre-modern sense. They came out of mostly the great nations of Europe, the French nation, the German nation, the Italian nation, are complete constructs of modernity. They're just kind of invented. The Swedish nation too, yeah.
Oh, exactly. I'm sure. So if we can acknowledge that all nations, where you draw the bounds and what's the thing these people have in common, besides in many cases just the borders of a state, but even when there is a core group, how you define that group and what subvariants and what local cultures and dialects were squashed to create this nation identity in early modernity. In many cases, like if we decide that the concept of nations are all arbitrary anyway, from the pre and postmodern sense, then fine. Just like you can come up with groups. And if you're going to come up with groups on a grassroots level, they're going to be smaller and more decentralized, obviously, because if it's going to be genuine and grassroots, and I think culture must be, to be effective, it must be, bottom up. Then I think that's fine. I think the whole idea, and this is what my first thought about when you said you wanted to come on with this topic, is like, if we can decide that nationhood and everything are completely arbitrary, in every sense, then fine. If it can be bottom up and grassroots, then let that be your basis.
Yeah, I mean, really, like, what this really boils down to is, do you hate the state more than you hate particularism or whatever? Like, I think the state is the thing that makes these things bad. I think the state is the thing that makes nationalism bad. So if you take that out, if you de-fang the state of empire, of aggressive action, and I'm not to say that necessarily like these things have to survive real anarchism, which I don't think they do. I would say they have to go up in the market of ideas or whatever, or like the market. Like, does particularism, does parochialism survive an open market? Right? There's certainly some right libertarians think they do. I am not sure that they do. I know that a lot of left-wing market anarchists don't think they do at all. But I think that's something worth like exploring. And when it happens, this is the least of our problems, right?
Yeah.
Like what we are doing is destroying coercion. If we destroy coercion, if we can really make a society without force, then everything else is just seeing like what happens when like people are really free.
Yeah, I agree. I do think that freedom and free markets absolutely act as a counteracting mechanism to like parochialism and conservatism, just in the sense of like the opposite of dynamism. So no, so that's, yeah, so I do, but I think of that as an argument, kind of like you're saying, that if you do support the pan-secessionism, even when it is less liberal, or not like a movement that centers liberalism and liberal values, that the overall dynamic of kind of this pan-secessionism that you're describing does have this counteracting mechanism of like freedom, free markets, and sort of a cosmopolitanism that forms from that. So yeah, I don't think you'd get what, and I've always hated this critique. I don't think you'd get what some people described as that's just decentralized fascism. I don't think you get a preponderance of quote unquote decentralized fascism.
I think it's worth pointing out that there is no fascist because and this, but like, let's just make it clear. Like, fascism is not for decentralization. Like, there is they're diametrically opposed ideologies. And if Orania in South Africa, right? They're born like ethno-nationalists, right? But to call them fascists when they literally just want like a tiny little space where it's like oh, weed. I mean, it's really just like the Amish. When you take it out of like the people contextualize it in the history of apartheid, which I mean was bad. Like apartheid is bad, and there was also like Afrikaner extremists that wanted to violently overthrow the South African government once it became anti-apartheid. But these specific guys, like Nelson Mandela, went to their community, and they were like, and he said they were good. They were, they were not opposed to, whatever, post-apartheid South Africa. Like, this is the thing. Like, really, like fascists want imperialism. They want large states. They don't care about little tiny polities that want to do their own thing. It's inherently anti-fascist.
So, yeah, fascism is quite literally the merger of the individual identity with the nation state. Right. So I agree with you that they would much rather a large centralized state, the corporate body, where all, the large population is all dancing in rhythm to the same drum. Now, most of the fascists were also ethno-nationalists, and that's awful for its own reasons. I have zero love for any of that, but it does not you can be ethno-nationalist without being a fascist. A fascist it's a specific political economy, right? It says it doesn't necessarily equate to a specific no, I mean, it does necessarily equate to a specific political economy. Ethno-nationalism does not necessarily do that in terms of what the economy looks like or what the structure of the nation state is, or any of those things. They're related, but not the same, right? So while I'm also not a fan of like weird ethno-nationalist small communities or whatever, that's also not my jam. But no, you're right in the sense that it's not decentralized fascism, although I think there is a relationship there, but they're not the same.
No, I've always had a long-standing position that I would not sacrifice the possibility of like any sort of liberation, or any sort of devolution of power, any sort of things, anything along the line, the categories that we're talking about here, just because like there might be a racist community or multiple ones. I don't think that, because I frankly, I think that would be in today's culture, in the slim minority. I mean, I think maybe. And I don't think it would have been generally at any point in history, as racism is kind of a thing that's come and is going, has come at a certain time, not too far in the recent past, and is going. And, and not that there would be any sort of idea that is going to be worth, I think, throwing out the ideas of decentralization or devolution or liberation. I think the overall effects will be net in the good direction. So I would not like torpedo the idea because of the possibility of, something nasty going on in some corner, some territory. I mean, it's like every other argument against, lessening the power of the state. Like, yeah, what if there's child abuse? Well, there's child abuse now, and it's a ongoing societal problem, perhaps, but it's not something, yes, I cannot make the guarantee that so-and-so won't occur under a libertarian governance structure, under anarchism, et cetera, but like neither can authoritarians.
Well, but Penguin, you have to admit that politicians are much less likely to molest and rape children than the average population.
Yeah. So, I think also, yeah, we can certainly kneecap the concept of politician as a career path by actually eliminating the place that they plug themselves into in society, and the role, I guess, in society that they take on for themselves. And we might even see politician as being like a personality type or like a social role. And I think the majority, I think most everybody listening to this podcast would like that class of people to kind of just go away, not have a place to be who they are.
Yeah, they could be, club promoters or whatever.
Yeah, put the skills to use somewhere more peaceful.
So, are there any secessionist movements that you're excited about? I mean, what do you think of like Rojava, or what do you think of? Well, let's go to the past a little bit. Sort of the Black Panthers and the Black nationalism surrounding that. Is there anything else you're kind of excited about?
I know that you said you only kind of just or one of you guys like kind of just breeze through our video inventory, but we have videos on both of these movements.
Right on.
I would say I'm a little. I'll give the bad news first. I'm a little skeptical of both the scale and the how do I put this? The commitment of Black nationalists in the United States. I wish it was as strong as it was in the 1960s. The Not Fucking Around Coalition, that's the big one right now. And unfortunately, its leader was jailed actually protesting the Breonna Taylor verdict.
Mm-hmm.
So, hopefully, like that movement, which I think is totally, well, again, not libertarian, but one against the American empire, but two, I mean, specifically because of like its nature is like anti-American judicial system, which is good. I think, yeah, I hope it grows by leaps and bounds. Certainly better than the quote unquote BLM like centralized whatever authority, which is seems to me at least social democrat or whatever. Like if the Not Fucking Around coalition becomes like the heart of like Black resistance to like state tyranny, I think that will be a unambiguously good thing. I'm sorry. What was the other one that you brought up?
Rojava and
yes.
Syria.
Yeah, Rojava. That we have a video on it, although it's quite old now. It's like a year and a half because I mean Rojava has been going on for so long. The only thing I will really say is I hope that Iraqi Kurdistan is integrated in Rojava in the near future. They have a alliance / truce with Assad. Apparently Turkey is attacking them, which is bad. Although also like Iraqi Kurdistan, the politics are very complicated. I hope Rojava continues to exist. It's a good thing. It's unironically like I'll say something about anarcho-communism. I would say anarcho-communism as it exists in a lot of the world is anti-liberal. And the people don't understand pluralism existing, like people that disagree with them existing in like separate polities. But Rojava specifically was founded with Bookchinism. Bookchin was someone in the anarcho-communist tradition that's singularly understood that there needed to be pluralism.
So Bookchin is a democratic confederalist. He started out as an anarcho-communist, and then later moved more into, yes, what you're saying, like a pluralist, but that's where a lot of the ideas of municipalism and democratic confederalism kind of come from. They're actually okay with markets, but it's much more of a sort of a distributivist and sort of localist style of markets.
Exactly. Like, yeah, I really admire Bookchin, and I admire the people that follow Bookchin, and that includes the Kurdish what do they call themselves? The revolutionary government or whatever.
Yeah, the YPG and PKK. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they get, like, there's no taxes. There's no taxes in Rojava. There's like I mean, I'm sure it has problems with governance or whatever, like everywhere does, but it is extremely laudable. Like Brian Kaplan, for example, wrote the anarcho status of Spain on the anarcho-syndicalist rule in Catalonia, right? And they really did like rule like a state. Well, Java, on the other hand, does not rule like a state. There's voluntary force, just like Magnovia. I mean, probably even better because, like, unlike Machno, I mean, like, you know, the municipalism allows for things like market processes, you know, money, you know, like inter-community economies and all that. Yeah, I mean, Rojava, like, if everywhere was like Rojava, things would be so much better. Even as like a right libertarian, like I think like markets should be more robust or whatever. Like that would be my like complaint living in Rojava. Not that like people are like starving or being like mass murdered, because that doesn't happen in Rojava. Doesn't happen in there's like a specific like ideology. It's like, what is it, like libertarian municipalism? Is that what it's called?
Yeah, that's a good term for it. Yep, that's what it's usually called. Some people also call it democratic confederalism, which is a slightly
that's
different
right
thing.
You know what, that was what I was looking for. But yeah, but like that like thing, like if the world was a democratic confederalism, like I would be so much happier.
Okay, and this is an inherently like decentralized, and inherently this is you're onto something here. So this is an inherently decentralized and inherently localist type of project, just the way we were talking about, like Karl Hess's idea. This is very central to what we talk about. Actually, I do consider Karl Hess's total ideas, like his prescriptions, to be basically like a libertarian municipalism. And those two ideas in this general milieu, what we're talking about, is, well, for one thing, I mean, it totally overlaps with like how I say is like good or real anarcho-capitalism. Keep in mind, Hess is one of the first people, if not like the first person, one of the first three people, I think, to use the term anarcho-capitalism in writing, and he always called himself that. And most people reading his books would not identify that with kind of necessarily the popular or vulgar notion of anarcho-capitalism. So he's really kind of, that's one of the reasons why I've come around on the term. So I'm right there with you, man. I'm right there with you, and I think you are right there with Hess. And then if you look at even maybe there's maybe a more left or right perspective on these ideas, but something along the lines of a confederalism, like, okay, here's something that they do in Rojava. They have like, it's like a openly feminist a democratic governance structure where like women have like twice the vote of men or something like that, and that's their thing. Well, that's their thing, and you might have quite the opposite somewhere else, and yeah, people might not like that either. But it's let 1,000 flowers.
A thousand flowers bloom. Wait.
That's the springtime of nations, right?
Yeah, exactly. Wait, yeah. I actually wanted to ask, like, have you ever seen, like, you've listened to any of my videos or whatever?
I haven't yet. No, about that.
Oh my god! Our tagline is literally "Let 1,000 flowers bloom."
I might have seen that somewhere, or maybe it's just so obviously fitting to the project.
Literally every time, about. Like the end of every.
It's the springtime of nations, so I don't know if I just made that connection in my head automatically, but yeah, it's the springtime, the flowers bloom. Yeah, exactly. Actually, I've had a Rojava video queued up on YouTube that I've never gotten around to watching, but I totally, if you have one, I'm as much as I've read tweets about it, I am drastically uninformed about Rojava, except for stuff that I've heard in podcasts. Although I've heard a podcast with like a guy that was from there, and people that have fought, I know people that have fought in the with the Kurds. Nonetheless, like it's super. There's a reason why that movement in particular is super, super important in kind of the space, the general milieu of like my Twitter feed. Basically, it's up there. It's one.
I think it's also
the closest thing.
It's worth saying that, like, I mean, I feel like, like social anarchists have kind of like, they've made it like, and of course, like Bookchianism, whatever you can say about it, it's certainly part of the social anarchist milieu, but like individualist anarchists can certainly look at it as part of their thing too, because that's part of Bookchianism. It's a synthesis between individualism and social anarchism. So like I think there's a lot of voices on like the left that are just saying like Rojava is where everyone could be if we just accept communism or whatever. But I think our specific video is like this is what anarchism can look like because of the high pluralism. It's just like people, the Yazidis, there's Arabs involved, there's Turkmen, there's all kinds of ethnic groups. They're all together because they really like villages can just be like associate with each other, right? And trade with each other in this like governance structure. It's not a state. It's it's a way of conducting trade, etc., defense, all that.
All right. Well, we got to basically wrap it up.
All right. Wait. Quick fun fact. Quick fun fact. The reason that the women are overrepresented in the military in Rojava is because they were fighting ISIS in al-Nusra, and at least this is what I read. Who knows? Everyone lies everywhere, but apparently, ISIS and al-Nusra, they don't like getting killed by women. They really don't like getting. They feel that they die dishonorably that way. And maybe Penguin, you could speak to this in some way, but they feel it's not like they're dying a warrior's death by getting killed by a woman. So they fear actually even engaging with the Kurds many of the times because they have such a significant military women in the military force.
Yeah, I have no idea if that's true, but I know that the Kurds were famous even before for having they actually do have they've long had a strongly and like I don't know the words de jure, but like a de jure basically feminist government structure. So they give the women, this is long-standing, they give women twice the votes for whatever theory they have about feminism, and they've always tried to have like women be as just, I mean, this is pretty unique for any culture on the world. Just women have just as much a responsibility. I don't know if it's 50-50 or if whatever it was, but basically just as much responsibility for defense as men, which is typically in most societies, even if it's open to women, it's typically considered a male responsibility. So, and that could be originally out of necessity, of course, but you see a lot of countries that have like conscription and stuff. But yeah, no, from what I understand, like that's like built into their governance structure, the equivalent of like constitutionally, you know. So it's a very interesting concept, and you know, like I said, it's one way of doing things for sure.
Well, I run the house, so my girls know how to handle themselves as well for the same reason. So,
I actually just a quick question. To clarify, your belief is that it's a Kurdish tradition, not something that came out of, for example, like the whatever left-wing nationalism of the PKK. That like the women.
No. I think it predates it predates the recent Syrian war. It does come out of the left wing tradition, but I think it predates.
Okay.
Yeah, it predates the recent stuff. I think it's at least been going on for decades, I believe.
Right. So it doesn't have to do with like women being like whatever, like ghost soldiers that will just like scare. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. There might be. I mean, there might be some. I'm sure that's actually true as far as what Sex said, as far as actually what those guys thought. But they've been doing that for a long time. They've been, I think, pretty famous. It's just I don't think the Kurds had as much publicity. Like I certainly rarely heard about them before. But also before the recent ISIS conflict, I wasn't on Twitter, and I wasn't looking at libertarian stuff, and I wasn't looking at the left-wing and anarchist thought either. So I really can't tell you exactly how much I would have ever cared about the Kurds. But yeah, anyways, we got to wrap it up. Where can people find your content? I know you're primarily a creator on YouTube. I see you post a lot on Twitter. Good, interesting niche you've carved out, I think, ideologically. But yeah, where can people find your content? Yeah, Charles Henry Lee is our main Twitter account. Springtime of Nations, Google Springtime of Nations on YouTube. We have a site. We have springtimeofnations.org. We the big thing of that is just putting up transcripts of our videos. Yeah, I think that's about it. I'm Adrian Shepard. I mean, may or may not want to follow me. If you like Nick Mullen from Cumtown's humor, you may like mine. But
you two both grew on me at the same time, so it took a while, but yeah.
Yeah, I would not say like it's a acquired taste maybe. But I when I post as Adrian Shepard, I don't represent Spring and Nations. Charles Henry Lee, that's where you should go if you want to get real Spring and Nations content. Other than that, yeah, I think we're good.
Well, thanks for coming on, man. This has been a good conversation. I enjoyed our back and forth. Hopefully we both got a lot out of this. I know I did, and hopefully the audience did as well. So, I welcome you back on anytime, man. This was a good conversation.
Great. It was a pleasure.
It was right up our alley. I'm really happy that, we kind of added to our collection of kind of thinkers that kind of are in our milieu and kind of expanded our milieu a little bit. So maybe, it's food for thought for our listeners. And yeah, we should definitely come back, and you can definitely come back and talk anytime. It's, I'm sure, endless amount of topics and examples and stuff we can talk about and debate.
Great.
Yeah. Right on. Well, everybody be excellent to each other, and follow us on Twitter at Agora_pod.
Agora_pod, yeah. And we have Sec also moderates a bunch of channels, our Telegram channel, where we have a Telegram feed. You can just talk also with our fans on the other Telegram channel. And do we still have a Discord?
Yeah, Agora the podcast on Discord and Telegram.
Hell yeah, dude. All right. Peace out, everyone.
Peace.
I want